Good evening. Thank you all for coming. We're going to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Shanna Cox, the President and CEO of the Chamber, would you please lead us?
Yes. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So tonight we'll be having a joint workshop and with the Finance Committee and Planning Board and to review the Lewiston Capital Improvement Plan. And I understand we have members of the Planning Board and the Finance Committee here. Perfect. And so if there are questions from the Planning Board or Finance Committee, we'll, at that time, when you have questions and there is at the time for questions, we'll invite you to use the podium and to state your full name along with what board you are on. And now I think we'll begin with our City Administrator, Heather.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Heather Hunter, thank you.
City Council, Planning Board, and Finance Committee members, I'm pleased to present to you the proposed FY23 Capital Improvement Plan. This is a plan that's required by the city charter that covers a 5-year period of time for capital projects that are being proposed. And the document before you is for the period of FY23 through FY27. All projects included in the document total $184 million, and $154 million comes from city resources. That includes operating budgets, bond projects, and so forth. The difference between those two numbers typically are federal funds available with the FAA, as well as cost-sharing arrangements for the joint agencies with the City of Auburn. You see, this is kind of a summary not only for what is proposed for the immediate 2023 budget, as well as the 5-year period for 23 through 27. It shows you both amounts that are scheduled to be bonded, as well as those anticipated to be funded through the operating budget. So we're looking at total projects for the 2023 of $32.8 million for the next fiscal year, and over the 5-year period of $153.6 million for that period. Although those numbers may look a little steep, they are actually down from what was submitted in FY22. So if you look at FY2's 1-year projection, it was $23.7 million, so right about the same, but the 5-year period was $176 million. 3.3, which the biggest difference probably between the 2 years are the ability to pull 2 of the large ticket infrastructure projects, the redundant water line, as well as the storage tank at the treatment facility, and use American Recovery or the ARPA money to fund those projects. This is what the proposed bond schedule looks like over this 5-year period of time. So it's kind of bouncing all over the place. City operations has some significant requests in the next immediate fiscal year of $23 million, and then it tapers off to its normal, midline request of $13 to $16 million. The school department has a request that they're funding over a 2-year period of time, starting in FY 2024. That includes evaluating central office in 6 through 8 space, and what that project looks like, and design and construction or acquisition for those. So they're still evaluating that. The water department stays relatively constant through the year. We do have a bump in 2024. Sewer and stormwater, again, those are normal maintenance operations. We have the last several phases on a stormwater project, so that's why you see that significantly taper off. And 2026 through 2027. Because debt reflects the lion's share of the financing for these projects, this presentation discusses a lot about debt service, our bonds, and so forth. So this is the first of a series of slides that adjust or in that topic or introduce that topic. This is currently looking at all funds, what the city's debt service looks like as of December 31st, and looking at everything that is authorized on issue. So you see the city is about $43.4 million, the school is $75.4 million, but I will want to point out that of that 74.4, $43.6 million of that is reimbursed through state subsidy for the 3 school construction projects. Water has the $19.6 million outstanding, sewer's looking about 17.1. The stormwater fund is about 12.3. We have some legacy debt service related to tax and financing for the Exit 80 projects of about $660,000. We have just shy of $36.7 million of authorized unissued debt. What that means is the city council has authorized the issuance of that debt, but the city has not sold it on the market yet. So we have 2 capital improvement plans that are outstanding right now. The 2021 and the 2022 make up the lion's share of that $36.7 million. We are getting ready to sell the 2021. The settlement date on that is going to be March 2nd. So we're getting ready to go to market with that pretty soon. We're getting the official statement ready and getting the rating agency calls ready. We typically delay a sale of a bond issue almost a year to make sure all the projects are ramped up, because the IRS has what's known as a 24-month spend down from sale date. So they want all those proceeds liquidated in 2 years. So that gives us kind of a lead time in order to make sure everything's out to bid, all the projects are ready to go, and so forth. The other measure, or the other litmus test, is looking at debt service as a percentage of the operating budget. For the current fiscal year, FY22, the city's operating budget or percentage was 15.6%. I will say that is normally or abnormally low. Normally, we hover around 18 to 20% of the operating budget. We had the city pension bond paid off in the previous fiscal year, which allowed us that reduced debt service percentage in the current year operating budget. School has been consistent right around 10%, and the total debt service in this particular year was 11.4%. I will share with you from a city standpoint, the city's peak was in 2015, and we ran about 29.5% of the operating budget. So as they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I use 2005 as kind of our poster child of what not to do with the city debt at this point. That was the city's peak at that point. We're over $101 million in debt. It had about $71.8 million in principal and $29.7 million in interest. At that point in time, the city council, recognizing the impact on the operating budget and so forth, they started discussing and implementing what we want to do for debt limitations. So you will see when the limitations really started to take an effect was in that 2015, 2016, 2017, and has continued forward into recent years when we've had some rather large building structural projects that have come along. So this is what the city currently uses to manage our debt. We've lowered the debt authorization limit to 80%. In October 2009, we started at a 97% debt limit. And we'll talk about how that's calculated in a few slides. Then in 2011, we lowered that, or the city council lowered that from 97 to 80%, which is what it stands now. In that 12-year period, we have only exceeded the debt limitations 4 times, and those are all related to significant projects, like the middle school addition, the high school addition and the cultural center, those types of things, those really large projects. The problem, which I guess it's a good problem to have, is because our debt service is contracting so much, that 3-year average is shrinking. So now, as we're bringing fire substations online and some of those other projects, it's rather difficult to stay within that debt limitation. So it requires all of the boards and the recommendations to really vet that to determine. It's not that the city council can't exceed the limit, but it requires a supermajority vote of 5 to exceed the debt limitation. The other option that we look at is refinancing debt. It's just like financing your personal mortgage. You're refinancing or getting a new mortgage on there to lower your interest rate. We, in the municipal market, call that refunding. It's the same idea though. It allows us to take high interest debt and resell it at a lower interest debt and save some money. Since 2010, through the refunding process, we've saved about $11.6 million doing that. Part of the sale that we have coming up, we are looking at 2 refundings in order to, right now the projections are saving about $1.1 million in cash over the remaining life of the debt. So it's definitely worthwhile to do that. The third option is to move recurring expenditures into the operating budget. That's a balancing act that you as the council have to deliberate, because obviously if you're moving those big ticket projects into the operating budget, your tax rate tends to increase and you want to manage that tax rate level. So the last option that we've been looking at is using unallocated fund balance, or what's known as the rainy day fund, to fund one-time repairs and capital acquisition costs. The City Council approved a fund balance policy that requires us to maintain a floor of 8% of revenues and a ceiling of 12%. Annually, and I think we discussed this at a few council meetings ago, the City Council has hovered right around that 10% mark. I'm pleased to say that for FY21, our end of year results have a fund balance rate of 17.11%. So it allows us about $7 to $10 million to use for this purpose. And what that enables the council to do is look at some of these requests that we had scheduled for bonds and move it into being funded from the rainy day fund, or the surplus. Not listed out here, and you'll see in a slide coming up, is also having a rapid payoff of your debt. So with the low interest rate environments, we are able to kind of maintain the same dollar value, but we shrank the year that it was going to be outstanding. So our average used to be about 15.5 years. We are now down to about 8.5, 9 years for payoff, which has allowed us to really, the bad part about it is it keeps that higher percentage of the operating budget, but it's saving us a mega amount of interest. So this kind of illustrates that process. This is what general funds debt service requirements are, not only for the current year, but for the next 5 years. And you see how quickly that's dropping. And that reflects not only the lower interest rates in the out years, but also that rapid payoff of principal. Now we move on to what's been requested in this current year capital improvement program. So the first group are the airport projects. The first project related to the east ramp construction has an FAA contribution as well as a local share. So that's why you see such a big difference between the total cost and the city resources. The rest of those airport projects are considered local projects, which means there's no FAA contribution. The city of Auburn and the city of Lewiston are splitting the cost of that project. So you see the terminal and hangar roof repair project, the big hangar door replacement, the landslide side terminal project is funded over a period of time, given the significant cost of that. It's a large space. They need to do major improvements in the design of that, and it's triggered a number of EPA storm drain remediation and retention regulations, which of course have negatively impacted the cost of the project. The last portion of, or the last project listed is the fuel dispensing. That's kind of bringing the current system back in line with regulations, and it allows for fueling with an attendantless system, so they can fly in at night and fuel without having personnel needs there. The Transit Committee, that's our annual appropriation for buses. We budget $50,000 each year. It allows us to accumulate the local share of that. So when buses are needed, the funds are there. That is traditionally funded through fund balance. Likewise, the citywide revaluation, that's a 5-year project. This is budgeting for year 2 of that project. It allows the city to go out and hire a contract to help evaluate all the parcels within the city, make adjustments to the evaluation. It allows, when the actual implementation, they will be there to help answer questions and evaluate the numbers at that point in time. That will also be pulled and funded through fund balance. The economic department has a series of projects here. Each year, we've been funding various canal ownership projects that helps evaluate the canal system, repair leaks, maybe do some bushwhacking, fencing, and so forth. Likewise, the Riverfront Island Master Plan and the implementation of that master plan has had an annual allotment, and this is to continue the walkway. We're looking at preserving or maintenance for the red shop. That has some development opportunities, but we need to make sure the building is kind of secure structurally. So there's funding associated with that. The Continental Mill River Walkway, this based upon the dollar value, that will be probably pulled into fund balance. And then lastly, the Bates Mill 5 cleanup. That is a project that has been kind of going back and forth for a number of years. This project, because of the remediation and so forth, costs have significantly risen to look at the environmental cleanup with that. We do have a brownfield grant for a portion of that. We are looking to hear from a $1 million earmark grant that I'm hoping we'll be able to hear the next couple months. And further, there are additional environmental remediation grants that are becoming available. So we're hoping we can fund the lion's share of that cleanup through federal fund money with a little bit of local share match versus funding it all internally. The fire department has 2 projects. One is moving to the Main Street fire station replacement. It's that turn, and then we'll move on to the next substation. So we're doing kind of every 2 years with the substations until they all get renovated and or replaced. They have also requested a fire pumper to replace engine 5 for $850,000. The library trustees, through the library strategic plan, has asked for about $308,000 to modernize their children's room. repairing and replacing the shelving units so they're more mobile. That includes furniture and fixtures for activities and programming to bring that room up to date. The MIS, or our IT department, has a list of upgrades that are found on page 47. The bulk of that $445,000 request represents the complete phone system replacement. We have an antiquated system. We're having difficulty getting replacement phones and so forth, so it replaces that system. Planning and code enforcement have requested $100,000 for the comprehensive plan implementation. That is contracting assistance to do some zoning and code amendment revisions on behalf of the city. The police department, with the lease of Mill 5 pending, one of the things the department went through is looked at furniture and fixture needs based upon moving in, and particularly in the locker room area, as well as the training room. This number obviously was a ballpark. They're refining that, and I anticipate that number being whittled down a little bit. Moving on to the buildings portion of the Public Works, or the division of the Public Works Department. One of the larger ticket items there are the parking garage revenue collection system. That replaces the ticketing and billing system for all of the parking garages in the city right now. Currently, the credit card portion of that system is not compliant. We've had issues. The software is out of date and no longer can be upgraded. Prior to COVID really playing a role on the utilization of the parking garages, people were getting billed wrong. They were not getting proper change. They were getting locked in the garage. It was a series of not customer service friendly incidents with the parking garage. So now, all of the gates are left open. There's no, if there is any charge or revenue sources, it's basically the businesses that are doing the annual or the monthly permits, or the dailies are on the honor system. And with COVID and the number of people that are working remotely, we were going to have an impact on revenues anyway. This hopefully, as we come out of COVID a little further, this will get the infrastructure in place to start billing again. Likewise, we need some repairs for the Canal Street parking garage. The Public Works Facility Master Plan is in phase 2. Design was in phase 1, or at least the needs assessment was in phase 1. They're looking at doing some conceptual planning here. This is something that would qualify for the fund balance project. The Public Works building roof needs some work. Again, based upon that dollar value, that would be a fund balance item versus a bond. The HVAC system at the library needs about $100,000. This repairs, there's two, and I'm not the HVAC expert, but there's two systems on the roof. We've done one. This is the second one that we're looking at upgrading. If the Armory HVAC unit does not take all of the ARPA money, this project would qualify for ARPA funding if there's a surplus left over. So talking about the Armory has the next two projects. For those of you who did the tour of the Armory building, particularly in the basement, you now know why this $3 million is being requested. This not only addresses the water infiltration and the sewer infiltration in the basement, it also looks at rehabbing that space for office space for the LA Maples, as well as the locker room, the shower area, provides ventilation and so forth. So that is the lion's share of the needs within the building for this first year. As you might recall, the previous council had approved the design work, so that project would be up and running based upon the funding level that is approved for this project. The exterior rehab for doors, windows, and the dentile work on the roof trim also need work and refurbishment. That, based upon the dollar value of the next two projects, both of them could be moved through fund balance coverage. As we saw in the airport, their fuel replacement system, Public Works has the same federal requirement as far as fuel stations and doing some construction work. This is the design work of that fuel station, and then next year would be the actual construction of the refueling station. Looking at highway, the good news is the bottom three projects are annual allotments that we've been doing for a number of years. The Park Street, Chestnut Street is the full construction that we are looking at focusing on this year. The two surprises were Jordan Road Bridge and the Bridge Street Bridge. DOT came out and did an inspection, and both of those inspections did not fare very well. So we need to do some work on those two bridges to bring them back up into compliance. The sidewalk and the street maintenance, you will find a detailed listing of what is proposed on page 75 and 77. I will say those projects that are eligible for CDBG funding will be evaluated, and perhaps some of those streets and some of those projects can move over to that funding source. We have one DOT project based upon the city requirement of $15,000 of the local match that will be moved to the fund balance. Municipal Garage does an annual request each year for a series of equipment and vehicle replacement. They're asking for $1,364,000. The detail of that is found on page 84 and 85. The last several years, we've been able to move that into the fund balance request, so that we haven't necessarily had to bond that. Open spaces, looking at a series of trails in particular in the Cody Street Playground. The last two projects, the Plord Walkway and the Cody Street Playground, are part of the exchange program for the National Park Service Land and Conservation Fund. The city, prior to even me starting here, had received federal funding from the National Park Service that allowed to create parks and a recreation facility in the city. Unfortunately, part of that federal funding required that to be maintained in perpetuity. As the years passed, that was not maintained in perpetuity. A few years back, the National Park Service did an audit to see where these projects stood and discovered, obviously, we had since replaced them and they no longer served as recreational facilities. Part of the agreement is to replace like-kind services. So we need to replace like acreage and like dollar value. So our two replacement projects are the Plord Walking Trail and the Cody Street Playground. Those are the last two of the agreement that we have worked on with the National Park Service. Public Works streetlights have two projects that they are looking at doing for various single and light upgrades. The light portion, the last project, would be funded through fund balance. Then we have a series of school projects that total $1,070,000. The kitchen, Lewiston High School kitchen upgrade, obviously, is to look up doing some update design and replacing some antiquated equipment. Most of the other projects are self-explanatory and were part of the current year budget that have come to fruition, and it's their term for funding. The next group of slides deals with our utility funds, water, sewer, and stormwater. Those are funded through utility fees, not through the tax base. Most of these projects deal with various maintenance and compliance with federal regulation in some way, shape, or form. So that includes like the CSO separation, the last project there. That includes some of the inspection and rehab systems and so forth. So you will see those various projects. The first project that's on there is the master plan and rate study. It allows some modeling to be performed to look at usage in future years as our apportionment with the treatment plant and potentially with the MOU with the Sabbathstown being evaluated. The rehab of the sanitary sewers and manholes, that's an annual appropriation. The equipment replacement program and sewer replaces a 2008 dump truck. And the Randall Road pump station is contingent upon that MOU with the town of Sabattis getting signed. So that may be a flexible project, and if it is signed, part of that would be reimbursed through their user fees. The CSO, the combined sewer overflow projects, are split between sewer and stormwater. So you see sewer's portion here, and then stormwater's portion on the top there. Stormwater, it does a lot with culvert replacement. So you'll see the Webster Road culvert. Again, that was a project that arose from a MDOT inspection. So that made it to the list. We have our normal storm drain inspections. And then sewer pays for the drainage work related to all of our road rehabilitation projects. So general fund pays for the actual paving portion. The stormwater pays for anything related to stormwater remediation. We're looking at the final phases of the Jefferson Brook Channel project that relates to the Robinson Gardens culvert replacement. And then we have the annual Hart Brook water quality restoration, where that's a multi-year, multi-phase project. So again, we're coming down to the end of that project as well. That replaces, looks at doing a bioretention system in that area. From the water fund, we're looking at the final phase of the dark fiber replacement for the water SCADA program that helps with emergency protection and security of our water system. We have annual allocation for the distribution main replacement. In the water fund, we are looking at a dump truck wheel loader that's going to be split between 2 years, so this is the first payment on that. Meter replacement program, that includes the the radio reads. Sewer reimburses 50% of the meter program as part of their operating budget. So the meters are split between these two systems. The handheld radio reads allow us to, just kind of like the CMP trucks, go out, absorb that data, upload it into our billing system. The second part of that project requires a customer portal on our website. That will allow customers, whether they're landlords, business owners, property owners, to look at their usage, their water usage. So they're not waiting until the end of the quarter and getting a surprise and finding out, apartment 3 had a toilet that was running for the last several weeks and you didn't know about it. So it allows that's going to be requested as part of the water operating budget in order to get that functionality working. And then the Central Avenue and Main Street water pump stations both need a little work. We rotate which pump stations throughout the system have work done each year. Oops. So when we talk about the debt limitation, this is the calculation that you're looking at to see what our threshold is. So we look at payments, principal payments for the last 3 years based upon tax-supported debt. So you have the city and the school. We back out the state reimbursement for the three school construction bonds and get a 3-year average. In this case, it's just under, or just about $9.3 million. Then we apply that 80%. So that reduces the limitation from $9,278,000 down to $7,423,000. Right now, the tax-supported projects total $24 million. So we're about $16.8 million over that debt limitation as we stand now. And if all those numbers kind of, this is probably a more simplistic version of how that calculation works. So we've asked for $24,219,000. Per the limitation, we're at $7,423,000. So we're $16,800,000 over the limitation as it stands now. This is the first step in this process. The council will receive recommendation for both the Finance Committee and the Planning Board. We, as a group, will discuss all of those projects through the budgetary process. You will see, and the team has already talked about, we need to evaluate these. We need to really take a hard look at what can be accomplished within the next fiscal year on these projects. Recognizing construction prices are at an all-time high. Is there any way we can defer some of these? And then look at what other funding source? Do we have current surplus proceeds available to us to use? And then what can be funded through that rainy day fund, that fund balance project? Typically, the council reduces the overall requests on average by about 20%. So here's what the schedule looks like from here on out. The council will host a public hearing on February 1st. The Planning Board and Finance Committee's recommendations are due February 23rd. On March 1st, which is the required adoption date by the city charter, the council will adopt the LCIP. That's accepting the document. You're not appropriating any funds at that point. You're just accepting the document. The first council meeting in June is when we talk about the actual appropriation of which projects will get funded. So this is just accepting this document and kind of putting it on file for evaluation. Questions?
Lots.
Councilor Pease?
No, I'm
Oh, well. Councilor LaChapelle?
Is the interest, is it a fixed rate, variable rate? What
It's
is
fixed rate.
fixed rate? What is our percentage at this point?
Right now, we've been averaging about 1.25, 1.7.
It's not bad. Even though the cost of construction's high, we're at a
Exactly.
historic low
And borrowing,
borrowing.
yes.
So let me ask both administrators, one behind each other, is it wise for us to maybe pump more into this stuff to try to get things out quicker?
It makes financial sense. The only word of caution I would throw out is, A, the impact on the operating budget for debt service payments, and B, what the increase might trigger with the rating agency's evaluation. Because right now, the rating agency considers our debt high but manageable. But it will, if it gets much higher, and it did impact back in 2005, it did impact the city's rating. So it's kind of balancing those two pieces with the financial sense of borrowing when rates are low, knowing at some point they're going to go up.
Thank you.
Councilor McCarthy? And Councilor-
Isn't the interest rate atmosphere on the upswing now? So by the time these bonds are issued, we'd be looking at more than what we're currently paying?
Right now, based upon the reofferings that have gone to market recently, they aren't moving significantly. What is happening, even though it's high inflation, which really typically triggers higher interest rate, there's not a demand for money out there right now.
But isn't the feds raising their target rates on interest?
But the local banks don't need to borrow from the feds right now.
Okay.
The money supply is too plentiful, so it's keeping the rates low.
Thank you.
Councilor Pease?
I'm just curious on, what's our rating right now?
AA minus stable.
I'm sorry.
It's a AA minus, but it's
AA minus.
but it's a stable outlook.
Okay, thank you.
For reference, is that good or bad?
It's not bad. Given, right now, there are two things that are holding our rating at that level. One is the demographics, the other is the debts.
Thank you. Further questions from the council? Councilor McCarthy?
How much revenue is generated from the free parking garages if they were working?
If they were working, about $800,000.
Okay, thank you.
And that was pre-COVID too.
Understandable.
So, yes.
Thank you.
Councilor LaChapelle?
Is that annually,
Yes,
800,000 annually?
yes. And it was increasing until COVID hit.
Lose a lot of money.
But it's not just because of the software. You also lost a lot of people due to remote working.
Correct. The parking garage on Lisbon Street is almost vacant now because you lost the college and you lost First Light and you lost
TD Bank,
that
Exactly.
gateway that was so,
yep,
yeah, put a lot of money into that.
right.
I understand it's a skateboard park now, so that's good.
Clement?
Councilor Clement, thank you.
Right there. Just for reference purposes, Administrator, the best bond rating AA plus or AA double plus, or
Yes, yeah.
one of the two, or?
You can go AAA too.
Okay,
Typically municipalities don't receive that ranking.
okay, thank you.
Questions from the, would it be appropriate, Administrator, to take questions from Planning Board or Finance Committee?
Certainly.
Are there questions from Planning Board members or Finance Committee members at this time? There does not appear to be any questions, Heather.
At this point, everybody has the option to kind of read through the document, formulate specific questions on projects. Typically, both committees, the Planning Board and the Finance Committee, assemble their questions. I have gone back to both to discuss and address questions that they have. At this point, anytime, or, once you formulate questions, please submit them. That way we can research it and then submit it back and/or revisit them. Like I mentioned, on February 1st, the public has an opportunity to weigh in on some of the projects that are listed here. They will have another opportunity, likewise, when we actually authorize the bonds. That's a public hearing authorization or opportunity as well. So the public gets 3 times to weigh in on some of these projects. And it is of value to hear their responses. And then as we move through the operating budget season, projects will kind of be allotted for the funding source, and it gives you, as a council, another opportunity to ask questions on specific projects. But at this juncture, that would conclude the workshop, and if you want to move into the special meeting for the executive session vote.
Thank you. I think we might have a question from Shanna Cox.
Sorry to have not hit the right segment of that opportunity. Shanna Cox, Planning Board member. I have a question that's largely for Ms. Hunter, but I think I would also be interested in hearing the City Council's thoughts as the Planning Board moves through our process over the coming weeks. Last year, there was a lot of discussion about the implementation of the tax assessment, which is a pretty meager annual amount of, I think, like 128 roughly. There was a lot of discussion, and I don't know, based on the recommendations that we sent to council, if we heard feedback from that council and acknowledging that we have a largely new council this year. I think it would just be helpful to name this question, even if it's addressed in your process and not tonight. That is tied into the ability, oftentimes, and I think it even came up in the presentation tonight, there's a criticism against the city of Lewiston as we seek to attract new residents as well as businesses about our tax rate. And the tax rate is a function of our evaluation, and there is a proposed hypothesis, at least, that if we updated our valuation, we could have a lower tax rate to get in the same amount of tax dollars, which would make us more competitive. And one of the recommendations, or at least questions, that the planning board held last year was, could we recommend that you fund that at an abbreviated rate, given the amount of the dollars are pretty small? So you could implement that in 2 years, for example, with $260,000 a year allocated, with an overall benefit to our economic development, population attraction goals. And so I'm just curious if it is proposed at a continued stretched rate because that is the way assessments are done and you couldn't physically assess the city faster, which would be really helpful feedback and we wouldn't discuss it further. And if the city council had any thoughts on that process of evaluation as it kind of feeds back into our overall revenue stance and opportunities. Thank you.
Feedback from Administrator Hunter?
Certainly, and Shanna's right, it was discussed at length at the council level and at various boards. For the new benefit of the new councilors, there was 2 steps in order to implement the revaluation. The first step is to essentially get off our significantly antiquated tax software. We are in that process now. It has had a few COVID delays, but it is still scheduled to go live July 1st. We could not do a revaluation on our current tax software. When I say antiquated, some of it is DOS and earlier. I'm not sure what is earlier, but anyway. The second component, our chief assessor has reached out to various pricing companies that would assist with this process. Based upon the number of parcels we have, the industry we have in our community, it would not be able to be performed faster than a 5-year period. So that's why we funded it over that project. If you accelerated the funding, you're just leaving the funding available to be there. The work would still need to be spread over the 5-year period. Once we get to that point, and she's exactly right, right now we're running about 83% of the state valuation. Don't quote me on that, but it's hovering right around there. It may be a little higher than that now. It would allow, it's a math problem from that standpoint, that if you're going to increase your base that you're dividing it by, which would be the increase in value because we're bringing it up to market, it decreases the tax rate. So that's one product or one benefit of it, is the perception of a lower tax rate. The other not so positive perception of a revaluation is the tax shift between commercial industrial to your residential property owners. So at that point in time, from a council and a school committee and school board level, we need to be very strategic on how we implement that. It would be very prudent to kind of hold that operating budget number as close to constant between those 2 fiscal years as possible, at least for that 1 year, because that way, any shift that a person's going to get is going to be directly related to the revaluation. They won't have the argument that, well, you guys increased the budget and you increased my value. It's one moving target at that point. So that would be, but again, we're a few years off for that, but that would be kind of the strategic recommendation when we're looking at implementing that, because it provides an easier explanation when somebody comes in to dispute their valuation. You don't have to say, okay, X amount is related to the increase in budget, but then you got the increase in the homestead, and now you have your increase in valuation. They have 3 moving parts at that point.
Questions from the council? Councillor Scott.
So first off, I'd like to thank Mrs. Cox for bringing that up, because this was a very extensive conversation that happened last year on the planning board and in other areas. But I also would like to thank Heather for that explanation, because this is a huge topic that comes up in our community, and a discussion that people assume that once we get this valuation done and it's changed, that our mill rate is going to go down and we're going to see these big shifts. So I think that it's very important that this conversation continue to happen and the explanations continue to happen on a regular basis, so that the community understands exactly how this is happening, especially people like me that are not great in math sometimes. It's really important to get that out there, I think, to the public, for them to understand what this is exactly going to mean, even though we still need to get it done, because it's, 30 years
Oh, yeah.
past due.
And,
Right.
and I will offer, if I could, Mr. Mayor, the chief assessor does typically right before the budget process, kind of does his assessment update for the city council. So you can see exactly what our current year percentage of market it is, and talks about those shifts and so forth. So it's part of that education process to keep having him come back with that messaging, so it keeps sinking in slowly and slowly. And then obviously the year before actual implementation would be a whole public education campaign.
Councillor McCarthy.
Just a off-the-cuff guess, what would the mill rate be this year if we were totally revalued and going on to the new?
Lower, he did,
I know lower,
yeah, he did figure it out. I don't want to misquote him. I can send that out to you.
Okay.
Because he does calculate it both ways. You're not the first that's asked for that, so I will ask him to do that.
Great, thank you.
Further questions from the council? Planning Board and Finance Committee all set? Administrator Harner, thank you very much for this presentation.
Thank you.
We will now be moving to executive session to discuss an economic development issue of which premature disclosure of information would prejudice the competitive bargaining position of the city. May I have a motion? Councillor Clement, may I have a...
We move into executive session pursuant to MRSA Title 1, Section 405, 6C.
Second.
That's an economic development issue, for disclosure of which would prejudice the bargaining position of the city.
Thank you, Councillor Clement, and I heard Councillor Scott. Thank you, Councillor Scott. We are adjourned. Thank you. We're not coming back.